New Year's?
No, I just wake up, record these podcast episodes, I go back to work, and then I sleep.
Wow, sounds like a really fun grind there. There
Yeah, every day.
you go.
What about you?
It's still 2020 and COVID, so my game plan for now is to just try and survive until next year and then start having fun again. So,
Awesome. I'm super excited to have you on the podcast. Uh,
yeah,
start
thanks for
off
inviting
by
me.
start off by introducing yourself.
So, my name's Kate Hollist. I am an attorney at Kronenberger Rosenfeld, which is a San Francisco based law firm that specializes in general internet based law. So, we handle a broad variety of internet related actions. So, everything from crafting terms of service to ensuring FTC compliance and compliance with various privacy regulations around the world. And then litigation as well. So, copyright, trademark disputes, cyber squatting, defamation, you name it. Within that firm, I am our sort of resident video games and esports related attorney. So, I specifically work with clients ranging from game creators and publishers, content creators, players, franchises, just pretty much anyone who is in or adjacent to the gaming space. And I work with them on a variety of different issues. Mainly right now, what we're doing is less about litigation focus and more about preemptively trying to work with them to help avoid litigation, since this is still sort of a developing space from a legal standpoint. A lot of the laws in this area haven't been established yet, which means that most of my time is spent helping anticipate and predict what are going to be the legal issues that my clients are going to be facing tomorrow, 5 years down the road. What are sort of the hot button topics of legislation that we're expecting to see coming out, or enforcement of already existing legislation that we expect to see starting to get applied, and how do we help our clients navigate around those in a way that's going to prepare them so that they can hopefully, as much as possible, avoid litigation in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, I noticed in esports like the space is evolving so quickly with like technology, but people don't know law. Like they get into the space and they're like, let's just go create this random company and get some money and then like do whatever we want. I'm like, you can't like in most cases you can't even get the money. And so like if you get the money, then you definitely can't do whatever you want because there's so many things which I know from my own startup company, creating events and working with different publishers, and it's just really a hassle if you don't understand the law, and you can get into so much trouble.
That is true, I think, for every entrepreneurial kind of mindset person. You have people who they know how to build a business, they know how to network, they know how to identify a need and logistically actualize, here's what needs to be done so we can meet this need. But there's a certain set of skills that are, legal oriented. So what's the law? How do I comply with the law with this business? How do I do that with a business model that the law has never addressed before? So that's where I think we see a lot of that predictive need, especially in esports, like you said, because this is a space where already you have, in general, I think entrepreneurs are not always aware of here's all the laws, and they shouldn't be, right? Because we want people focusing on actually building the business, not memorizing 1,000 different statutes that might apply. That's why they hire people like me. But the thing is, with esports in particular, you're exactly right that because the technology is changing so quickly, and not just the technology, but public awareness of it, public interest in it, and then the legal sphere that it's operating under is still very much in flux. So it creates this perfect storm for clients where it's very challenging for them, unless they do have a lot of legal training, to know here's what I need to do to stay compliant. Here's what I need to do to stay compliant to a law that hasn't been passed yet, but that we think is likely to come down the pipeline within the next couple of years. Stuff like that, that if you are looking forward, you can save yourself and your company a lot of money down the road, but it's hard to know how to do that. And I think so often with attorneys, our first reaction is always, hey, you need to be more careful. Let's slow this down. You can't do what you think that you can do, kind of to what you were saying about people get the money and they're like, all right, let's go. And the attorney is so often, unfortunately, in the position to say, no, I'm sorry, you can't make that happen. Our firm is more about trying to empower our clients to be able to say, look, this is what you want to happen. You can't do it this way, and here's why, but here's a couple of alternatives of what you could do. And then again, since we're in more of that predictive space, we try to break it down for here is like your riskier option. Here's what we think is a safer option, and then leave it to them to sort of make the business decision of what is the path that they want to take.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm learning more from the legal standpoint, like working with just a few local attorneys and attorneys across the globe. I'm like, wow, there's so many things I didn't know I could have access to in terms of like
Mm-hmm.
legal support as an entrepreneur. Now that I know I have access to them, I'm just like, why would I not do this? Like before it was like, oh, okay, well, maybe I could get an attorney, but now it's like, I have to get an attorney.
Yes. I think unfortunately a lot of people think of attorneys only when everything's already hit the fan, so it's we've got a fire, we need to put it out, we better hire an attorney. When really I think for especially if you're a smaller startup, it's better to think of us as more like insurance policies where it's something that you invest in early to help avoid the risk and mitigate the risk so that you're not going to be shut down because you've got a giant FTC action coming down against you or a huge lawsuit that comes out, or you didn't get your proper consents and you didn't have the right disclosures. And, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. But if we wait until they've already gone wrong, the tools in the toolkit to help you are a lot more limited versus if you do it ahead of time and you anticipate, hey, there's a chance that, we're putting together this website and we're going to be reaching out to users from everywhere and sending promotional emails, promotional text messages to them. So we want to make sure that we're compliant with the current laws. If you have that in place ahead of time, you're protected against the more major, expensive, damaging kinds of litigation later. Like you can't make it so that nobody will ever sue you. People are going to sue for completely baseless reasons all the time, unfortunately. But you can mitigate the type of lawsuit that you're going to be facing, where that kind of lawsuit can be brought. So you're not just going to be hailed into court across the country. You can put it into arbitration, get class action waivers, all these kinds of protections that why would you think about it when you're busy forming a company? Because you have other things to think about. So I like coming in and having that just be my job. You worry about getting your business up and running. I'll worry about helping make sure that your business doesn't get shut down the road.
Awesome. Thank you for your response. I appreciate your perspective on this. I think when I was younger, starting out as an entrepreneur, like after I closed one of my esports companies in January, I was like, you know what? Probably could have made this work if I had some more legal support because even though I had funding, like I didn't know uh, the legal side of how to make the business work. Like I knew how to get the sales and like do marketing and things like that, but it's like the legal side is just something which I was really realizing like, man, if I had understood the law better and I knew I had options, I didn't have to close the business. I could have just pivoted and then
Sure.
done something where the business could grow and scale and be sustainable that way. I just didn't have that type of experience back then.
Right. Well, it's tricky too because it's hard to know necessarily what kind of lawyer you even need. One thing I didn't understand before I went to law school actually was this idea that there's tons of different kinds of lawyers, the same way that there's tons of different kinds of doctors. And you would never go to a pediatrician for cancer treatment, for example. You want to go to a specialist who's going to be able to help you with your issue. And when it comes to esports law, it turns out that that is a huge umbrella that covers a lot of different areas because you've got to worry about all the intellectual property disputes. You have to worry about compliance with regulations, not just in the US, but overseas. You have to worry about contracts and contract negotiation, and then the terms of service and user agreements that the players are bound to in the different games that they're playing. There's just so many things interacting in one space. So unlike with like a family law attorney where you can really specialize and say, yes, I do family law. It's a specific body of law. There's a kind of a finite number of cases and case types that you're going to come up against in esports, and then also true in sports law and entertainment law generally. You have to wear a lot of hats, and it's really hard, I think, when you're founding a business, when you're getting a new business off the ground, or even just when you're maintaining it and running it and trying to scale it up like you were talking about. It's hard to know what kinds of lawyers you even need in the first place. So one of the things that I try to do with my clients is help just keep them updated about, hey, here's some general changes that are happening in the industry. Here are some general concepts that are being floated around. Let's talk about how this is going to affect you, if it's going to affect you, or if it's something that maybe means we want to move more quickly into expanding in a certain direction, or we might want to reconsider expanding in another one. So honestly, a lot of what I do is just sort of act as a resource gathering point of reference for people, so that when I do reach out to my clients, it's not just them saying, here's a problem that I want to address. It's me saying, look, we've been monitoring these law changes and these bills that are being proposed and these comments among the community. So with esports in particular, you really have to pay attention to the community, partially because the law is on like a 10-year lag, right? So the regulations that are coming out now and being applied now to gaming companies, to streaming platforms, to everyone, we're just starting to see litigation that's really esports oriented in the last few years. So you really do have to pay attention to, here's what the community is saying are some issues that are coming down the pipeline. And so gathering all that information and presenting it to the client as, here's kind of how things have changed since we last touched base. Where do you want to go from here? And I think that that's one of the more valuable things that we bring to the table, because it allows entrepreneurs to focus on building their business instead of having to worry about what is happening, what is changing out there. And we can just stay on top of that for them.
Awesome. Thank you for your response. So my first question would be, what is it that you're looking to become and do within the next 5 years within the esports space?
My goal, and it's admittedly a little bit ambitious, I would like to help develop more of a consistent framework for clients who come to me about, here's what we can actually anticipate in terms of the laws as they exist today and the laws that are coming down the pipeline. Like I mentioned, we don't have a lot of certainty about that right now. When you think of, here's how a copyright claim is going to be interpreted, you can go back and look at 100 years of case law on copyright laws and how courts look at them and how courts are going to decide one party's rights over another. Esports is so new that we don't have that yet. What we do have is a lot of theory about, here are how things are likely to change, how things are likely to be interpreted. And there are so many unique facets to esports that it's really difficult to apply some of these old standard laws. So for example, in traditional sports, let's say that you have a player who gets kicked out of the league, like someone gets kicked off of an NFL team and they're blacklisted, they can't play in the NFL anymore. Well, they're not banned from football. They could still go and play football. They could coach football. There's lots of different options that they can do that are still involving football. You have someone in esports who gets banned from the game. That is it, because the game exists as somebody else's intellectual property. So that developer, the publisher, has rights about how that game is going to be played, who's allowed to play it, how appeals work, who decides the appeals. All this is sort of baked into the cake with esports, where you don't have that with traditional law. So my goal within the next 5 years would be to help provide some clarity and sort of create a model for clients going forward on, here are some tried and true methods that we are starting to see that do work. Like I said, right now, we just have a lot of predictive ideas about how these things are going to be interpreted. And we do have some case law starting to come through. But so as a result, we're creating these shotgun approach models that say, like I said, here's a sliding scale of risk. And here's where you want to be if you want to be super safe. Here's where you want to be if you want to be on the riskier edge, but know that there's a chance that you could get some bad case law that comes out, or some bad regulations that come out that shut you down. So what I'd like is, over the course of the next few years, to develop a network and work with people who are sort of thought leaders within the community to establish, here's what we would like to see from a legal standpoint on how these things get interpreted, and then work with my clients to build up frameworks that are going to support that. So with the ultimate goal that eventually, at some point, we're going to see some clarity on how courts are going to look at different various esports related issues. I would like if we could start receiving those decisions, and then also to be able to contribute to that thought process. So not just sitting back and waiting and saying, here's this decision that's come down, but being involved with the people who are making these decisions. So I can provide that legal perspective on, here's here's what we think is the right call for the community, but we have to be conscientious to these legal concerns.
Awesome. Thank you for your response. You're going to see me looking down here. I'm just taking some notes on my phone.
No
Just
problem.
trying to grasp what's happening because from my perspective, like I remember that I had a player once who was in the process of being like his contract was about to expire. He wanted to join another org. And basically what the other org did is they sent a representative to get the player out of their contract. And like it had to happen within like 24 hours or else they were gonna like uh, do some legal action against the company. And I was like, well, the the reality is that you just have to let the player go in that case because their contract is about to be up. And so it's like if we let them stay for the extra day or week or month, year or whatever, like the potential long-term outcomes, like the benefit is okay, well you have the player, but then the negative is like, okay, now you have to deal with legal action against whatever the player wants from your company, which you're not providing, which would be released from the contract and at a sooner date, which in some cases you just can't do that, unfortunately, which is like some people think that they can just be released from their contract at any time, which is true, but sometimes you have to uphold every single agreement and to the point where you can actually be released from your contract. And some of these players, they think that, they might be a month away from being released and they're like, okay, well, can I just get out now? And I'm like, actually, you can't. Like, even if I wanted to let you go, I couldn't let you go because, A, B, and C statute
Right.
or, X, Y, and Z things to be upholded before you can even qualify to be let go at an earlier date.
Well, and part of the problem is that when you're talking about professional level players, these are often people who are very young, and especially when the contracts are getting negotiated in the first place, a lot of times they don't have legal representation, or it's somebody who's not familiar with the space. And so contract provisions that we would normally see in this type of contract don't get inserted in because the player doesn't know what they don't know about contract law, right? So it's kind of to your point earlier about if you known from the outset what the options were, you might have made different decisions. So yes, I agree. It's very important to be connecting with parties on both sides from the outset so that we can provide for situations like this. So what you just described is one where the player wants to get out of the contract early. The org is open to the idea of letting the player out of the contract early, but something in the contract language says, no, you can't do this. Or sometimes it's not within the contract language, but it will be within the league language. So, whoever is say you've got League of Legends, Riot Games has, here's our requirements for you to be competing in this league. You've got your general sort of all player requirements, and then you've got specific requirements for professional level players. And so it's the interplay between all of that and then all the general laws that always apply to contracts, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. So yes, I all the time have people in all different kinds of businesses who want to get out of contracts and want to know what their options are there. And there's often the answer is there is a way out of the contract, but it's expensive because sometimes contracts allow for a party to walk away, but they have to pay a certain amount in liquidated damages, things like that. But sometimes the answer is no, you can't leave the contract because if you do, it could affect your eligibility to even play for a future organization. So all these things have to be taken into consideration, but it's challenging when, again, you don't have people who have the legal background to understand when they're entering into these contracts, what the consequences of some of these clauses are going to be years down the road.
Awesome. Thank you for your response. I appreciate your clarity on that. A lot of people who are viewers, they're like business owners and executives, and they understand that on a level, but some of the newer people with the esports and gaming, they're like, well, Adam, what do I do if X, Y, and Z happens? And I'm like, listen, man, I got an attorney. Like, you need an attorney, and I have someone who helps me with contract law, someone who does all of the intellectual property law with me, and then I do things down to like the level of okay, if I have PR relations, right, who's gonna help me with that? And it's just so many legal points which I have to protect myself now because like I don't want to get sued for something that I said on the podcast episode, or if I walked out into public and I happened to wear the wrong jersey or something. Like it's just all these little things that I could get into trouble for sometimes.
It's so true. And sometimes it's really frustrating for people because it feels so arbitrary. When you don't have that legal background, you don't necessarily understand, here's why this rule exists. So it just feels like, why can I do this thing and I can't do that thing? And it feels like there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's usually a rhyme and reason. Sometimes the rhyme and reason is that the legal landscape hasn't caught up to esports reality yet. And so we're dealing with an archaic law that just is trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, and it just doesn't work. But yes, it's a frustration that I hear a lot from people. It's just this concept of, I don't understand why I can't do X, or I don't understand what my path is if I want to do Y. Why is this so complicated? You talked about how you've got to work with, at this point, a lot of different attorneys. And that gets back to what I was saying earlier, where with esports law, it's not just one area. You don't just have contract lawyers involved in esports. You have to have contract attorneys. You have to have intellectual property attorneys, employment law attorneys, tax attorneys. It is just a huge space from a legal perspective because there are so many moving parts. Right now, mostly what we're seeing is concern over employment law type issues. So for example, California has recently significantly changed the way they view whether a person qualifies as an employee or as an independent contractor. And there's all sorts of regulations in California that apply for when somebody's an employee versus when they're an independent contractor. And historically, most players have been considered independent contractors to the teams to which they belong. But now there's a question of, does the new California regulation mean that esports players are going to be considered employees in the state of California? And that means a lot of things would have to change for many of the contracts that are now existing. And for the most part, our clients are they don't know that on their own. So that's what I was talking about earlier, where we have to come to the clients and say, hey, here's this change. It's finally catching up to the reality of esports law, but here's this implication for us where, this is a law that's designed to apply generally across the board, and it really works poorly in this space. But because the law is so general and there's so little public awareness of what a unique space esports is, there's not an exception carve out. There's a lot of challenges that companies, players, teams, leagues all have to face to try and make sense of how this is going to work. And if you don't know about it, you're not aware of it, you're not going to make those changes. And then you're opening yourself up to some potential liability later when you're relying on, okay, but we've always had these agreements in place where the players are independent contractors. Now all of a sudden a court somewhere holds that a player's an employee. What is that going to do to you? So that's just an example. I mean, you'd mentioned having to have all different kinds of attorneys, and yeah, that's exactly what we're seeing is the importance of having multiple hats be worn to fully protect an organization and players from liability, and to make sure that they've got the best option for growing their business, whether that's on the player side or as an organization, to make sure that they're going to be covered.
Awesome. My next question for you is, what are you doing really well that is helping you achieve your goals?
Ooh, that is a fun one. I am doing a good job, I think, of networking within the community. So one thing that's great about the esports community is I feel like there's definitely an eagerness right now to connect with other professionals in the space. So the number of attorneys who practice in esports law is pretty small. It's a very small legal community. And so far, everyone's been pretty receptive to connecting and to meeting up. I mean, in a COVID time, that meetups are a lot more virtual, but the idea being that I think that there's some receptiveness to, we want to work together to build something here. So that's, I mean, honestly, more of a reflection on the industry as a whole than anything I personally am doing. But I think that because of that, because there's that openness, there's a lot of willingness to sort of put heads together and pool resources, which is absolutely, I think, something that needs to happen in order to chart a course for the industry from a legal perspective, where, like I've said, there are so many archaic laws that just don't make sense the way that they're applied. And it's going to take some cases coming out that are going to be difficult and expensive and challenging to run to get the courts to start acknowledging, hey, maybe we need something different for this space. So connecting with people is very important to me, both in terms of obviously getting clients in the meantime, but also in terms of my more long-term goals of helping to chart a course, path some regularities, and decide here's what is the correct answer going forward, with some ability to rely on it instead of just at this point, like I said, the more predictive style of legal work that we're doing.
Excellent response. Yeah, I've noticed the amount of people who can actually advise me on esports law is so like few people. And like when
Yes.
I'm looking around the city for like advisement, I'm just like, I can't go to some like firms or something because they're like, okay, Adam, what do you do in the X situation? And I'm like, legally speaking, I don't know what to do because I've never had to encounter this situation before. And like for a lot of people, uh, they think that like because you might have experienced something in a different industry in the past that you might be able to just like transfer that knowledge. And like that doesn't always work. And in
Yeah.
this case, like for me, like I've had to shut down a business. I've almost been sued many times. So many times I can't even believe it. And it's just like the fact that I haven't been sued yet, it's just a matter of luck. And I realize to operate at the level that I do, just trying to mentor people into like private equity, venture capital, there's so many laws and regulations here where
Yes.
people are like, well, are you an accredited investor? I'm like, no, I don't need to be an accredited investor to be a mentor. Or we'll like, well, how do you like help people fundraise? I'm like, uh, I just tell you how to get the money. And like people don't really understand, like it's just storytelling. You just have to pitch and people will truly just give you the money. But like
Right.
they really want to complicate it and they're like, okay, well, what's the legality of it? And I'm just like, there's no legality. You just like find an accredited investor, pitch to them, and then like they'll know what to do. Like it's fairly simple in that way, but uh, of course there's some complexities where for me, I think I lost focus earlier this year because trying to fundraise all the time, but then you realize there are some companies which they never need to fundraise, and that's
Yeah.
great. But a lot of companies they never get to that point, and I'm just thinking, well, I've seen so many orgs and teams and uh, people who are using the agency model in esports, they've gone out of business recently, and I'm just like, listen, guys, if you're going to survive in this space, legally speaking, you're going to have to figure out a way to put yourself in a position where, if you do get sued, right, you need to reduce the amount of risk you have for every
Yes.
single individual employee, not just like not just think about your assets, but like on an individual personal level. Like I've had people who I was employing and they're like, okay, Adam, I don't have a job now. What do I do? And I'm like, listen, man, if you want to like stream or something, like I got nothing because like the business might have gone under or like you lose all your assets, which just happened to me. And so these are scenarios which are like worst case scenarios for some people. But from my perspective, I'm like, well, if I'd been able to protect myself and my employees better, then again, I could have made more informed decisions. And that's something which it really goes a long way in esports, and people don't really think that way.
Yeah, I think it gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where people think of lawyers as coming on board once the fire is already there. And when a fire is there, you've got, your tools available to put out the fire, but there's still going to be damage done in the meantime. So that can be very expensive to defend against litigation, for example, or if you've pathed your entire business in a certain direction, and then now you're realizing that's not going to be viable or sustainable because your growth options are limited because of the type of company that you're in or the type of industry that you're in or the contractual limitations that you have on yourself. So if you really want to keep options open, then getting involved with an attorney earlier on is always going to be a good option. The problem, of course, is that it can be hard when people are starting up and where assets are so limited to say, well, why don't you go drop, a few $1,000s on an attorney to provide some input on stuff like this. It's one of those situations where most of the time you're hopefully not going to need an attorney. You haven't actually been sued. That's wonderful. But if you need one, you get to the point where it would have been good to have one and you didn't have one. That's going to be a very expensive situation that you find yourself in. So yes, it does come down to mitigating risk and trying to limit it so that if you do get sued, the amount that you can be sued for is as low as possible. The place where they can bring the lawsuit is convenient and a place that you can get to and defend in. There's all sorts of variables that go into it. But yes, it's very challenging, I think, especially, like we said, for players and organizations that don't have a lot of experience in this space to try and figure that out. In 2015, I published an article that was an esports law article in the Arizona Law Review. And at that time, there were not very many other articles that were out in the legal space that discussed esports at all. So in fact, when I gave my initial draft to my editor, they came back and said, look, we need you to spend another couple of pages just explaining the concept of what esports even are, because nobody understands this concept. Fortunately, from that time to present, they've become a lot more explosively popular to where people have some general awareness now more often about here's the concept of esports. But you're still encountering people who are making these decisions from not from the players and orgs themselves, but the parties that they are interacting with and getting into contracts and agreements with that are unfamiliar with what this space even looks like. And so it can be very challenging to try to help educate someone and bring them up to speed about that concept. And like you said, a lot of the lessons that you may have learned in adjacent industries don't necessarily apply because there are some unique facets to esports that make it so that there's not a clean translation from one legal framework to another.
Excellent response. Thank you. So my next question would be, what are you not doing so well that's preventing you from achieving what you want to achieve?
I think probably the biggest thing right now is that I am not getting involved enough in kind of more long-term advocacy efforts. So I've talked about how my goal would be to have a little bit more clarity within 5 years that I can offer to clients as, hey, here's the right way to do this. We know that this is how this is going to be interpreted, right? But in order to get to that point, we are going to need, as a general society, to figure out how we want to deal with esports. Right now, we don't have like a regulatory body, like a players association that covers all players. There's lots of different smaller players associations that have started up, but we don't have, like, for example, the Overwatch Players Association as an official body that interacts with Blizzard. So what would be helpful is if we started seeing, these organizations trying to form, whether that's a players association or a regulatory neutral body that says, hey, we have these expectations for what you can require of your players. And if you want to be certified by us, then you have to meet these requirements, right? These are long-term goals. I don't think that we're close to getting to that. And that's unfortunately just the reality of being a newer type industry. And the fact that we've got, thousands of different games that make up esports. Like, that is such a broad title that having a single body that can regulate that is going to be very challenging. Having a single players association, basically impossible. So we don't have anything in place like that. But the result then is that we're just privatizing a lot of these regulations. So instead of having, an overarching neutral body that's sort of keeping an eye on things, we're basically saying, okay, developers, you guys have to make the decisions about what's going to be allowed and not allowed by your teams. Okay, teams, you guys have to make the decisions about what you are and are not going to allow for your players, subject to the developer things. But there's not like an overarching sense of here's what is expected generally from a neutral party. So you've got developers who, for example, and publishers who, for example, are going to be beholden to their investors. So you've got shareholders and companies that have a duty to make sure that they are acting in the best interest of the company all the time. And we're basically saying, okay, well, you guys need to set the limits of what can or cannot be required of players. Okay, well, but what about when that limitation is going to help the players, but at the expense of the shareholders? Can that company even legally do that? So we don't have anything in place like that right now. And that is so critical to get eventually. I think it's pretty ambitious to say that we would have something like that in place in 5 years. I think it's very challenging to have it at a government level because the government's so slow to respond to change. And esports in particular is an industry that is lightning fast. There's not an opportunity to have a long, drawn out, months long resolution of something where some of these games hit their peak popularity and then that goes away within a year. So I think that's the problem that I see as being a major obstacle to getting some of this clarity. We either need it to come from the courts and the government. I've mentioned why that's going to be really slow. We need it to come from, the developers and publishers. I've mentioned why that's inherently problematic. Or from the community, which doesn't have the ability necessarily to force a large scale change because there's not a collective bargaining association that publishers and developers are going and governments are going to recognize as like the legitimate negotiating body. So we don't really have right now a clear path forward to how we get to that level of certainty. What I could be doing better is working to connect with some of these people, these connections that I met, like I said, these global thought leaders in the esports community, about actually practically how to chart that course. So while I've been able to form these connections and we've talked about it, and I can tell you that this is definitely something that people are aware of within the space, is the need for something like this, just to help out with basic things like player health and well-being. Even though that's happening, there's so many moving parts that it's hard to know how do we get from point A to point B. So what I could be doing better is working with the people that I've connected with to try to path that out.
Awesome. I think the majority of my thought process, what I'm actually thinking about this is like, what do I do when I come to the situation that I don't know what to do? And
Mhm.
it's happened to me so many times this year where like I read the news, where like someone tells me something in private, and I'm just like, listen, man, I have no idea what to do. And like people are like, well, you've done this or this or this. And I'm like, yeah, but like esports is so new. Like I just don't have the knowledge. And so like there's some times where I don't have advice to give, or like I can't recommend somebody go talk to somebody. I'm like, I don't even know what legal authority you need to speak to about this issue. And like people are like uh dumbfounded because they're like, well, Adam, you've dealt with this. I'm like, yeah, but like that was my situation. Like you're in like some different universe with complexities I don't even understand, like working with this person. And
Yes.
like uh, esports is really strange because the way the industry works is basically I hear something and then I try my best to respond to it, but in reality, like you have a million different things happening to you all at the same time, and then you hear news and then you try and get that feedback. Well, what do I do now with this new information? But in reality, sometimes there's nothing to do, which is the right choice. And so for me, like it doesn't matter if it's A, B, or C. I just have to choose something, and hopefully
Mhm.
it works out because I don't have the, I guess, mental faculty sometimes to just make a good decision because there are a lot of things where I have no clue. Like if this is going to be something that exists 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 100 years from now in esports, like there's
Right.
no way to know.
Right. And that's again, that's a growing pain that you see anytime you have like a new establishing industry like this. We saw that. I think the most recent comparison would be when you started seeing internet law crop up in the first place. And up until honestly 5 to 10 years ago, there were still court decisions coming out where the judge would start with, what is the internet, and then spend a page or two describing the concept of the internet. I mean, that gives you an idea of how slow the legal community responds to new industries and new technology. And then at the same time, you've got these laws that are coming out, or these decisions that are coming out that could have sweeping ramifications for the industry. And then it's just a question of trying to race to decide whether that's going to apply, how it's going to apply. The most recent example that I can think of is the new measure that makes it so that streaming copyrighted music for a commercial purpose is a felony, right? So how is that going to apply to, for example, a content creator who is on Twitch or some other platform streaming a game which features copyrighted music? You have games that have already caught on that, hey, this is an issue, so they're releasing, copyright music free streamable versions, but even those have run into problems. So is this something where all of a sudden these content creators are going to be exposed to criminal liability because they accidentally, play a second clip of a song? That's the sort of thing where it's something that changes very quickly, and then all of a sudden we're getting phone calls from people freaking out about, what do I need to do, how do I need to change so that I'm not going to be exposed. And then you've got all the huge implications right now about so President Trump's been on a pretty hard push to get CDA 230 removed, which has provided a huge safety net for a lot of platforms like Twitch. So what are the implications going to be if that gets pulled away and those protections disappear? These are huge decisions that are going to have lasting impacts, and we have to respond in real time to guessing how these are going to affect specifically the esports community. Because I can tell you that Congress, when it's passing laws right now, esports is not even on the radar for them. So it's there's all these unintended consequences that our industry feels a lot more than many other industries, because it's just we're a blip on that radar when they're considering something like repealing CDA 230.
Great response. Thank you. Now, my next question is, what are you going to do differently tomorrow to meet the challenges that you're facing?
Well, I think the reality is that tomorrow I'm probably not going to do anything differently, because right now we're dealing with just a lot of putting out fires. So a lot of year-end legislation that's come down the pipeline that our clients are concerned about. Mostly what I'm going to be doing is addressing that and dealing with that. In the next couple of months, I've been actually chatting with a few people that I've been fortunate enough to be able to connect with about trying to kind of put together our heads in our different spaces that we operate in within that giant esports umbrella, to see about coming up with some modicum of agreement on, hey, here's what we think are some of the more likely outcomes based on the case law as it's developed now. One thing that's very helpful for me is that, especially, in 2020, in 2021, I'm able to connect with people from lots of different states and from different countries. And that in esports is so important, because it is not a business that's limited to one state, but it's affected by state laws and different countries' laws. And so you really can't offer advice in a vacuum. You have to be able to take those other laws into consideration. So I think that for the next year, what I'll be focusing on is working with people who are in different spaces within esports law and who are in different jurisdictions than I am in, to help start building some sense of consensus. And one thing that helps with that, so I've been a part of this group, the Internet Law Society, where we sort of brainstorm together some general internet law related issues. And I've been in contact with some of the leadership from that about, being able to talk to people more about video game and esports specific internet issues. What I'd really like to do is leverage these great legal minds that are already out there in adjacent spaces, to see what we can put together to help provide some guidance to clients that are in this space. And like I said, it requires a lot of different hats. I certainly don't pretend that I wear all the hats. For example, when it comes to tax implications for esports law, I am not the person you want to talk to. But fortunately, because I'm able to connect with so many people within this space, and because it is such a small legal community, I can often help connect people to someone who is going to be familiar with those issues. So for the next year, I'd like to do that with a little more purposeful approach and try to connect with people with the goal of trying to come up with some consensus on some advice that we can offer with reasonable certainty that's going to be valuable for clients going forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The feeling that I get when I speak with you is that there's so many things I want to understand about the law, but at the same time I realize, like, just practicing business, I'm going to run into mostly everything anyways. And
Yes.
so, like, I haven't been like outed as some crazy scandal person or whatever, but like the things that I faced in the past, like these accusations or what may be, like, I realize that there's a lot of things you can't control. And so, like, trying to protect yourself from something which may not necessarily be a danger, but it could be a concern. That's something where, if you put resources into that type of protection, you're going to realize eventually what you might outgrow that concern. And for me, like, I have very different concerns now at the end of 2020 that I did at the beginning. And
Don't we all?
yeah, I'm learning now that the real dangers in esports, especially in concerning the law, is that you're going to face new regulations and experiences where, uh, even if you have the best information, right, you might make a decision which could change the industry in a way which you can't really predict. And right now, I've realized some of the choices I've made in the past. I'm like, well, that business went under. Like, what do I do about that? Like, and people are
Yes.
like, uh, Adam, what do you feel when your business goes out of business? And I'm just like, I feel bad, but at the same time, it's like, I'm an entrepreneur. I have to create another business and another business, and this cycle will repeat itself.
Right. No, yeah. And I think that to your point about how there's all these new laws that are coming out and constantly that you're having to adapt to and plan around and work around, and a big part of sort of my goal. So I mentioned it's to provide a little bit more clarity about here's what we can expect. Part of that is raising awareness in general about the esports industry, not just to other people who are already keyed into it, but ideally to people who are not familiar. Because while it's a lot better than it was in 2015, when I got the comment that I needed to devote more space to explaining what the concept of esports was, there is still an educational barrier sometimes when you're dealing with the people who actually do have the power to make some of these decisions that will affect the industry, where they just don't understand what it is, what's unique about it. I mean, all the time we're still getting the question of like, are esports sports, right? These fundamental questions that still exist. And right now, legislation that's getting passed doesn't take esports into account, and it's not on the radar. I'd like to get to the point where we are on the radar, to where there's a pause and a consideration of, okay, how is this going to affect this industry? And honestly, the biggest way to get to that point is by continuing to scale up. So you look at where esports are today versus where they were 5-10 years ago, and there's been an explosive growth, but still in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty small insular industry where people who are aware of it are definitely aware of it. People who are engaged with it tend to be extremely engaged with it. People who aren't might not be familiar with it at all. So what we'd like to do is get to the point where the decision-making bodies, whether that's, legislators, judges, other attorneys who are dealing with these companies who are going to be contracting with esports companies and teams and players, where these people are familiar enough with the industry to start taking that into consideration. Because otherwise, what you're going to have and continue to see is laws coming out, cases coming out, where there's just no consideration to the impact that that's going to have to some of the realities of esports. And part of that problem is that, again, we're still seeing the legal community catch up to internet-based law in general. And so there are still times when just it doesn't quite work, and our legal framework that we have as a country is slow to reconcile with new industries across the board. And for especially in this space where you've got an interplay between internet law and software, which is something that our intellectual property system has always sort of struggled with, and all the employment independent contractor issues, you've got these international legal issues, just general contract disputes and questions about, who owns what when it comes to player performance, things like that. There's so many moving parts here. It's so easy to upset the ecosystem, but the people who are making the decisions that could upset the ecosystem don't know that the ecosystem exists. So I think over the next few years, what I'm hoping to see, and what I think that we can all contribute to, whether we're attorneys or players or business owners, anyone who's in this space, is just continuing to raise awareness about what a big deal this is and why it's not one that's going to go away. People talk still occasionally about esports like it's this fad, it's a temporary blip, and then we'll, get back to traditional sports as sort of being more the driving arc. But I think that consistently year after year, when you're looking at the numbers, you're seeing more and more engagement, whether it's directly with the community or just people who are more and more open to the idea of, for example, watching somebody else play video games. For me growing up, there was no greater sin in my household than to watch someone else playing video games. That just, it drove my poor dad crazy when he would come home from work and see my brother's on the Nintendo and I'm there just next to him watching. He's like, you're just watching someone else play. So overcoming that sort of educational hurdle about here's what this is, and this is the giant industry, and it's one that's going to continue to grow, and people are more and more engaged with their phones and with computers and with online content than they've ever been before, and that's not going away anytime soon. I think sending that message allows us to start reaching these decision makers, the people who have the ability to provide some certainty and some clarity in a way that's more likely to result in a positive outcome. The time to educate someone about esports law is not when you've got a case in front of them and they have this weird statute that somehow they have to apply that just doesn't apply naturally in this context. Ideally, we're going to be seeing some more eventual awareness of this topic so that the legislature is passing laws that make sense for application here. So, in terms of what we can do immediately, what my long-term goals are, what our long-term goals should be as a community from a legal standpoint, continuing to just beat that drum about, hey, here's this cool industry. If you're not already aware of it, let's help you become more aware. And then I think that one key component that I've seen our community be great with, but I'd like to continue to see, is a lack of sort of gatekeeping to new people who are coming in fresh, who don't have familiarity with it, being willing to take the time to help them understand, here are the different components and here's why this matters. So that when we do have people who are open to learning more about this space, they're not turned off because it's so hyper technical, or there's this strong kind of sense within the community of like, hey, we're not welcoming newcomers. You're just jumping on the bandwagon now that it's become popular. I think by continuing to be engaging and welcoming and open for people who are just now coming onto the scene, we help ensure the long-term health of the industry overall.
Excellent response. Thank you. My last question is, how can I help you and where do you feel you need the most help?
Well, my last answer kind of gets into that, but I think one of the things that's most helpful for me just in general is when people who are in the trenches tell me, here's what my problems are, here's what we're seeing. You talked about earlier about how sometimes the way that you become aware that something's a potential issue is you hear about it in the community. Like it's already happened to somebody, but it's the first time this has happened to somebody, nobody knows what to do with it, and it starts to spread like wildfire. Thankfully, we are in an industry that is very connected, both from we forge connections and it's a small community standpoint, but also just from a technological standpoint. I mean, esports, I think, is one of the most technologically connected industries in the market today. So the good news there is that we have access to information almost immediately after it happens. So when something comes down, it's like, hey, here's this issue, here's something that an org is starting to see, here's something that this player encountered. We learn about that very quickly and that disseminates quickly. The more that I can aggregate that information and gather that information, the better it helps me to help my clients to make sure that they are on top of changes, so that, maybe we need to drop a quick update to their their end user license agreement or their terms of service to account for some big change that's just come down. Or maybe we need to take a look at their contracts so that the next time that they enter renegotiations, we have this provision added in. So for me, just hearing about changes in the industry that people are seeing or concerns that they're having is one of the most helpful things, because it is so predictive right now. It's so difficult to know how things are going to affect various types of esports professionals, whether that's content creators or platforms or teams or developers, players, or even, people kind of more connected, not as directly. Like you've got vendors and you've got venues, all sorts of people who have their fingers in this esports pot can help us attorneys protect everyone by kind of letting us know when they're seeing something that looks weird or that they're not sure how to deal with. We don't know how some random new law in Texas is going to be interpreted until we start hearing about it from the community. So it's very important to me to have that connectedness. So if you're seeing something and you're like, hey, I'm not sure that I know what the answer is about from a legal perspective, how this is going to be interpreted or what we need to do to protect ourselves. Honestly, reading people's posts on LinkedIn and messages that I've received from people has helped me tremendously in making sure that my clients are protected to ongoing new changes in the space.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, Kate, and I appreciate your responses to these questions. It's going to
You're
be
welcome.
incredibly valuable for me just in the future moving forward, and also for everyone else who I'll be working with. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks again for reaching out.
Anytime. I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Bye.